The gavel struck the wooden desk with a thunderous bang. "All rise. The court is now in session." The murmurs in the packed courtroom fell silent as the judge, an older woman with stern yet curious eyes, settled into her seat. In the defendant's chair sat David Carter, a man who looked twice his age, though he was barely in his early 40s. His weathered face, covered in scruffy gray stubble, told a story of hardship. His hands, calloused from years of service, clenched into fists on the table before him. The charge: trespassing. The accusation: breaking into the same abandoned building he'd been seen sleeping near for the past 6 months. David had been arrested late last night, dragged out of the old warehouse on the east side of town. The prosecution painted him as a persistent offender, a danger to the community, a problem the city was tired of dealing with. But as David stood to address the court, his voice calm yet filled with an eerie intensity, the air in the room changed. "I didn't break into that building," he said, his words measured, deliberate. "I was looking for something. Something that's been hidden there for over 20 years. The prosecutor scoffed. "And what exactly were you looking for, Mr. Carter?" "A place to sleep." David's jaw tightened. His piercing blue eyes locked onto the man questioning him. And then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he uttered the words that sent a shockwave through the courtroom. "I was looking for the body." Gasps filled the room. Even the judge stiffened in her seat. The prosecutor, clearly taken aback, adjusted his tie and forced a smirk. "A body?" he repeated mockingly. "You expect us to believe that?" David turned his head, his expression unreadable. And then, just loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "I know who killed her. And I know where he hid the evidence." A silence fell over the courtroom, thick, suffocating. And just like that, the entire case changed. The trespassing charge no longer mattered. Because David Carter, the homeless veteran everyone dismissed as a nobody, had just revealed a chilling secret, one that someone in this room might not want uncovered. Flashback. 3 days earlier. Rain pounded the cracked pavement as David pulled his hood tighter against the biting cold. It was late. Too late to be wandering the streets. But he had no choice. The old warehouse had always been a sanctuary of sorts, a place he could rest without the constant stares of strangers who judged him without knowing him. Except tonight felt different. The moment David stepped through the rusted door, something in his gut twisted. He wasn't alone. A sound. Something shuffling deep inside the dark building. He crept forward, heart pounding. And then, he saw it. A piece of the concrete floor, chipped away, revealing something buried beneath. A plastic-wrapped object, peeking out from the dirt. David froze. Because he knew exactly what it was. And the face that flashed through his mind? It was someone from his past. Someone who thought their secret had died decades ago. They were wrong. David barely had time to process before blinding lights flooded the warehouse. Hands in the air. No. Cops. Guns drawn. Before he could explain, he was slammed against the wall, cuffed, and dragged away. No one listened. No one cared. They just saw a homeless man, alone, with nowhere to go. And now, standing in court, eyes scanning the faces of people who wanted to see him disappear, David realized. Someone in this room already knew the truth. And they were terrified he was about to expose it. A thick silence filled the courtroom. David Carter's words had shaken the very foundation of what was supposed to be a simple trespassing case. A body. Evidence. A murder hidden for over 20 years. The judge's eyes narrowed as she studied David's face, searching for any sign of deceit. The prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments ago, swallowed hard, suddenly unsure how to proceed. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, trying to regain control of the narrative. "A homeless man, suddenly claiming to have uncovered a 20-year-old murder? Your Honor, this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid punishment." David, however, didn't flinch. He turned his gaze to the gallery, where a few reporters were already scribbling notes. And then, as if speaking to someone specific in the room, he said, "You can keep calling me a liar. But you and I both know the truth is about to come out." A few rows back, a man in a dark suit stiffened ever so slightly. David saw it. So did the judge. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice firm. You're claiming to have knowledge of a murder connected to the warehouse where you were found trespassing. Do you have any evidence to support this claim? David exhaled slowly. I know where the body is, he said. And I can tell you exactly who put it there. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few scattered voices arguing over whether he was telling the truth. The judge slammed her gavel. Order! She turned back to David. If what you're saying is true, then why haven't you come forward before now? David's jaw clenched. He didn't answer right away. Because how could he explain that he had been trying to forget for 20 years? That he had spent 2 decades running, burying the memories, convincing himself that what happened that night was just a bad dream? But it wasn't. And now, the past had finally caught up to him. Flashback. 20 years ago. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that made it hard to breathe. David wasn't a homeless veteran back then. He was Private First Class Carter, fresh out of training, home on leave before his first deployment. He had met up with an old friend that night, Jared Lawson. Jared was one of those guys who had connections everywhere. A smooth talker, a man who always seemed to have something going on beneath the surface. They had gone out for drinks, but something about Jared had been off. Paranoid. Jumpy. Constantly checking over his shoulder. Then, around midnight, Jared had taken him to the warehouse. David hadn't questioned it at first. It was just an old building, a place they used to hang out as teenagers. But when they stepped inside, David saw something he was never meant to see. A woman. Dead. Blood pooled around her, her lifeless eyes staring at nothing. David's breath caught in his throat. Jared. What the hell did you do? Jared's face was pale, his hands shaking. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he whispered. She found out something. She was going to ruin everything. David took a step back. His heart pounded. Jesus, man. We have to call the cops. Jared snapped his head up. No. The way he said it made the hairs on David's arms stand up. Then Jared reached into his jacket. David didn't wait to see what he was grabbing. He turned and ran. Out of the warehouse. Into the night. And he never looked back. Present day. In the courtroom. David felt the eyes on him as he stood in front of the judge. I was there that night, he admitted, voice raw. I saw the body. I know who put it there. The prosecutor, who had been jotting something down, froze mid-sentence. The judge leaned forward. Are you saying you were an eyewitness to a murder? David met her gaze. I'm saying I know who did it. And I know that person is still out there, walking free. Another wave of gasps swept through the room. And then, for the first time since the trial began, David looked straight at Jared Lawson, now a well-dressed, respectable politician, sitting just a few rows behind the prosecution's table. Their eyes met. And in that moment, David knew. Jared had recognized him the second he stepped into that courtroom. And now, with his entire career and life on the line, David saw something flicker in his old friend's expression. Fear. Because for the first time in 20 years, David wasn't running anymore. He was ready to expose everything. A dead silence gripped the courtroom. David Carter and Jared Lawson locked eyes, the weight of 2 decades of secrets pressing down on them both. Jared, now a polished politician, sat stiffly in the gallery, his jaw tight, fingers clenched around the edge of the wooden bench. David could almost hear his thoughts. He's not supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to remember. But David did remember. And now, after years of being ignored, forgotten, and discarded by society, he finally had the one thing Jared never wanted him to have. A voice. The judge cleared her throat, breaking the heavy tension. Mr. Carter, what you're suggesting is a very serious accusation. If you are telling the truth, this court will need evidence, actual proof of this alleged crime. David didn't hesitate. Then send the police to the warehouse. The prosecutor scoffed. That building has been searched before. If there was a body, it would have been found years ago. David shook his head. Not if it was moved. Not if someone with power and connections made sure it disappeared. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. David glanced at Jared again. For a brief second, the man's cool exterior cracked. Got you. The judge turned to the prosecutor. "If there's even a possibility of truth in this claim, then an investigation is warranted. I'm ordering law enforcement to search the warehouse immediately." A uniformed officer stepped out of the courtroom, likely making the call. David allowed himself a small breath. Finally, after years of silence, someone was going to listen. But then, Jared stood up. All eyes turned to him as he slowly buttoned his expensive suit jacket. He stepped forward, clearing his throat, his politician's mask slipping into place. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, voice carrying the charm that had gotten him elected, "I hate to waste this court's valuable time, but this entire situation is clearly a desperate attempt by a man who," he gave David a pitying look, "is struggling. And, frankly, I sympathize." David gritted his teeth. This snake was already trying to spin the narrative. "I've been a proud supporter of our veterans for years," Jared continued, hands clasped in front of him like he was delivering a campaign speech. "Many of them face unimaginable hardships. PTSD, mental illness, addiction. It breaks my heart." A few people in the gallery nodded. David's fists tightened. This wasn't sympathy. This was damage control. "I truly wish Mr. Carter the best," Jared said, sighing. "But this is a fabrication. I mean, come on, 20 years later, and he just happens to remember the details of a murder now." He let out a soft chuckle, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, I move that we dismiss this nonsense and—" "She had a scar above her left eye." Jared froze mid-sentence. The color drained from his face. David took a step forward, his voice stronger now. "The woman in the warehouse," he said, staring straight through Jared, "she had a scar. About an inch long. Just above her left eye." Jared's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The judge frowned. "Mr. Carter, how would you know that?" David didn't blink. "Because I saw her. And I saw him standing over her body." The courtroom erupted again. Jared's hands balled into fists at his sides. His mask was cracking, piece by piece. David saw it. So did the judge. She turned to Jared. "Mr. Lawson, since you've involved yourself in this case, I have to ask, do you know anything about this alleged incident?" Jared forced a laugh, shaking his head. "Of course not. This is absurd." Bang. The courtroom doors burst open. A detective walked in, his expression grim. He marched straight up to the prosecutor and handed him a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a blood-stained necklace. David's heart stopped. He recognized it. He had seen that necklace on her neck that night. The prosecutor's face paled. He cleared his throat, then looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, the officers found this buried beneath the old warehouse foundation. Preliminary analysis suggests it belonged to a missing woman named Melissa Harper." The name sent a shiver down David's spine. Because that was her. The woman from that night. The woman who was never supposed to be found. Jared staggered back, his forehead glistening with sweat. David's gaze hardened. "You tried to make me think I imagined it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You let me spend years thinking I was crazy. That I was just some homeless vet who didn't matter." Jared didn't respond. Because for the first time in 20 years, he had no way out. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on. Jared Lawson, the well-respected politician, the man who had everything to lose, stood there, motionless, his once confident smirk now replaced with something else. Panic. The detective placed the blood-stained necklace on the evidence table. David Carter could feel every pair of eyes shifting between him and Jared. The once dismissive prosecutor now looked visibly shaken. Judge Monroe, who had been watching Jared closely, leaned forward. "Mr. Lawson," she said, voice level, "do you have an explanation for this?" Jared licked his lips, forced a breath. Then he laughed. A dry, hollow sound. "Your Honor," he said, regaining some of his polished composure, "am I really expected to entertain this nonsense? This is a setup. A piece of jewelry doesn't prove a murder, and it certainly doesn't connect to me." David clenched his jaw. Even now, he was twisting the truth. But the detective wasn't done. "Your Honor," the officer said, his voice steady, "there's more." The room went dead silent. The detective took out a small evidence bag containing what looked like a piece of old fabric, ripped, discolored, but still intact enough to recognize. Jared visibly stiffened. This, the detective continued, was found in the same burial site as the necklace. It appears to be part of a shirt that matches descriptions of what Melissa Harper was last seen wearing the night she disappeared. David exhaled sharply. This was it. The evidence was finally surfacing. But then, Jared did something no one expected. He smirked. And then, with complete confidence, he turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, I think I'd like to call my lawyer now." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyebrows raised. "That's an interesting choice, Mr. Lawson." Jared shrugged, still calm, still holding on to that thin layer of arrogance. "If this has turned into an actual criminal investigation," he said, "then I'll need proper representation. I'd hate to say the wrong thing in such an important setting." David gritted his teeth. This coward. Even when backed into a corner, he was still playing games. The judge exhaled slowly. "Very well. We'll adjourn for today and reconvene once Mr. Lawson has secured legal counsel." She banged the gavel, and just like that, Jared had bought himself more time. Outside the courthouse, David stepped out onto the steps, the cold air cutting through his worn-out jacket. He could hear the murmurs of reporters, the low buzz of conversation. For the first time in years, people were talking about him, but not as just some homeless vet. As a witness. As someone who had been telling the truth all along. A voice cleared behind him. "David." He turned. The detective from the courtroom stood there, his eyes sharp, studying him carefully. David had met enough cops in his life to recognize one thing. This guy believed him. The officer pulled something from his coat. A small business card. "My name's Detective Ryan Hale," he said. "I know what happened in there seemed like a delay, but trust me, Jared Lawson's going to have a hard time wriggling out of this." David hesitated, then took the card. "You think he'll try?" Hale scoffed. "Oh, he's not just going to try. He's going to fight like hell." He exhaled, hands in his pockets. "Guys like him don't go down easy." David nodded. He already knew that. "Listen," Hale continued, lowering his voice, "I need to ask you something. Off the record." David stilled. "Go ahead." The detective's expression darkened. "Is there anything you're not telling us?" David's heartbeat spiked. His gut twisted. For a moment, he thought about lying. Because there was one thing, one detail, he hadn't revealed yet. Not to the court. Not to the judge. Not to anyone. And if he did, it would change everything. But before he could answer, the sound of car tires screeching made them both whip their heads around. A black SUV sped past them, windows tinted. David's instincts kicked in too late. Because the second he realized what was happening, a loud pop echoed through the street. A gunshot. The reporters screamed. People scattered. David hit the ground as the bullet whizzed past his head, shattering the courthouse steps beside him. Detective Hale pulled his gun, but the SUV had already disappeared, speeding off into the night. David's breath came in short bursts. His hands shook. Not from fear. From rage. Someone had just tried to silence him. And there was only one person who had a reason to do it. Jared Lawson. David slowly got to his feet, blood boiling. They were trying to shut him up. Big mistake. He wasn't going anywhere. He was going to finish this. This is getting intense. Before we move forward, let's hear from you. What would you have done in David's situation? Have you ever seen a powerful person try to cover up their crimes? Let us know in the comments. And if you're enjoying the story, make sure to like this video and subscribe. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in David's ears. He stood there on the courthouse steps, his heart pounding, the shattered concrete beside him a reminder of how close he had just come to death. Detective Ryan Hale was already barking orders into his radio. Shooter just fled the scene in a black SUV, heading north on Lexington. Get units on it now. But David already knew, whoever had sent that warning wasn't getting caught tonight. This wasn't a random attack. This was a message. Jared Lawson was done playing defense. No. He was ready to eliminate the problem. A few hours later, At police station. David sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of him. His hands still trembled slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was from rage. The door opened, and Detective Hale stepped in, shutting it behind him. He tossed a manila folder onto the table, taking a seat across from David. "You good?" Hale asked. David gave him a sharp look. "Someone just tried to put a bullet in my head. What do you think?" Hale smirked, rubbing his temple. "Yeah, fair enough." He exhaled, then tapped the folder. "Let's talk about Jared Lawson." David leaned forward. "What about him?" Hale flipped the folder open, revealing old case files, crime scene photos, and missing persons reports. And right in the center, a black and white photo of Melissa Harper. David's stomach twisted. "She went missing 20 years ago," Hale said, pointing to the date on the file. "Vanished without a trace. No leads, no suspects. Her case went cold real fast." David swallowed hard. Because he knew why. Jared had connections even back then. He had made sure that no one ever found her. Until now. Hale leaned forward, studying David. "Here's what I don't get. If you saw what happened that night, why didn't you say anything? Why not go to the cops?" David let out a bitter chuckle. "I was 20 years old," he muttered. "Home on leave before my first deployment. I was just some dumb kid who thought his old friend wanted to hang out." His jaw tightened. "I didn't realize I was walking into a crime scene." Hale waited, letting him talk. David exhaled, staring at the photo of Melissa. "I wanted to tell someone. I almost did," he admitted. "But Jared, he knew where I was stationed. He had friends everywhere. He made it real clear, if I said anything..." David looked up, his voice cold. "I wouldn't live to see my next deployment." Hale didn't blink. Because he believed him. David sat back, rubbing his hands together. "I tried to forget. Spent years convincing myself I didn't really see what I saw. And by the time I got out of the army..." He let out a dry laugh. "I was just another homeless vet on the street. No one would have listened to me even if I tried." Hale sighed, shaking his head. "And now, 20 years later, here you are, finally telling the truth." David's hands tightened into fists. "Because for the first time," he said, voice deadly serious, "I finally have proof." Meanwhile, Jared Lawson's estate. Jared stood in his luxurious home office, staring out at the dark city skyline. The whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly. This wasn't supposed to happen. The past was supposed to stay buried. David Carter was supposed to stay invisible. But now, that worthless washed-up veteran had suddenly become a problem. Jared slammed his glass onto the desk. His phone buzzed. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. With a sharp breath, he picked up. "Tell me it's done," he said, voice low and dangerous. On the other end, a man hesitated. It didn't go as planned." Jared's teeth clenched. "Didn't go as planned." The man exhaled. "Carter's still alive." A pause. Then Jared let out a slow, cold chuckle. "All right," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Fine. If the idiot wants to fight this in court, we'll give him a fight." He turned to his desk, where a thick folder labeled David Carter, military records, sat waiting. Jared ran a hand over the file. If the courts wanted evidence, then he'd give them evidence. Because David Carter wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a target. And by the time Jared was done with him, the world wouldn't see him as a hero. They'd see him as a liar, a fraud. And by the time he was finished, no one would believe a damn word he said. The next morning, David Carter woke up to a nightmare. It wasn't the kind he was used to, the ones filled with war, gunfire, and the ghosts of fallen brothers in arms. No. This one was real. And it was playing out on every television screen in the city. News broadcast. Breaking news this morning. Shocking allegations have surfaced against David Carter, the homeless veteran who recently made claims about a decades-old murder tied to prominent politician Jared Lawson. David stood in the cramped motel room Detective Hale had put him in for protection, staring at the screen in disbelief. A female anchor continued, her voice carefully neutral. According to recently uncovered military records, Carter was dishonorably discharged for misconduct. Reports also suggest a history of aggression and mental instability, leading some to question the credibility of his statements against Mr. Lawson. David felt his breath catch. No, this was wrong. The screen switched to a man in a suit, a legal analyst shaking his head. "It's a troubling situation," the man said. Carter's allegations were already flimsy, but with this new information, it's hard to take his word at face value. I mean, a man with a history of violence and instability. How can we trust anything he says? David's stomach churned. He knew this wasn't an accident. Jared had done this. He had dug up old military records, twisted the truth, and fed the media a lie. And now the world saw David as the villain. Meanwhile, in Jared Lawson's office, Jared sat behind his desk, the news broadcast playing on mute. He leaned back, fingers tapping together, a satisfied smirk on his lips. "This should keep him busy," he murmured. A man in a dark suit, one of his fixers, stood across from him. "We're keeping tabs on the police investigation. So far, nothing linking you to the body." Jared's smirk widened. Of course there wasn't. Because he had covered his tracks 20 years ago. And David Carter, the nobody, the street rat. By the time Jared was finished, he wouldn't even have a place to sleep. Jared poured himself a drink. Checkmate. Or so he thought. At police station, in Detective Hale's office, David slammed his hands down on the desk. "This is *T. Detective Hale didn't flinch. "I know," he said simply, flipping through a thick folder of documents. "But it doesn't matter." David's jaw tightened. "How does it not matter? They're making me look like a damn lunatic." Hale exhaled. "That's the point, Carter. It's damage control. Jared Lawson is rich, powerful, and connected. He doesn't need to kill you. He just needs to make sure no one believes you." David sank into the chair, rubbing his hands over his face. It was happening all over again. Every time he tried to speak, to do the right thing, someone shut him down. First in the military, then on the streets. And now, when he was finally close to justice, Jared had turned the entire world against him. Hale studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, he slid a different file across the desk. David frowned. "What's this?" Hale leaned forward. "Proof that Jared's lying." David's heart pounded. He opened the folder, and what he saw made his blood turn ice cold. It was a classified report from 20 years ago. A report about Jared Lawson. David's eyes scanned the page, his breath catching as he read. Subject: Jared Lawson. Connection to organized crime and illegal money laundering. He flipped to the next page. A mugshot of a man David recognized instantly. A man Jared used to hang out with. A man named Dominic Russo, a known enforcer for a New York crime family. David's mind raced. Jared had always been dirty. And if he had ties to people like Dominic Russo back then Melissa Harper hadn't just been murdered. She had been silenced. Hale tapped the file. Melissa Harper wasn't just some random girl, Carter. He met David's eyes. She was a journalist. David's blood ran cold. She was working on a story, Hale continued, voice grim. A story about corrupt businessmen laundering money for the mob. She must have gotten too close. David's pulse pounded. This wasn't just murder. This was a cover-up. And Jared had been cleaning up the mess ever since. Meanwhile, at a dark parking garage, Jared Lawson stepped into the shadowed structure, his bodyguard close behind him. A black Mercedes idled near the exit. The back window rolled down. A pair of cold, calculating eyes stared out at Jared. "Mr. Lawson," the man in the car said, voice smooth but deadly. "We have a problem." Jared forced a smile. "Nothing I can't handle." The man in the car chuckled. "That's what you said 20 years ago." Jared's fake smile dropped. The man's eyes narrowed. "Make sure this problem disappears. Permanently. Or we'll make you disappear instead." Jared swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't the one pulling the strings anymore. The room was silent. David Carter sat at Detective Hale's desk, staring at the classified report in front of him. Melissa Harper wasn't just some woman who got in Jared Lawson's way. She had been a journalist investigating his ties to organized crime. And she had been killed for it. David's pulse pounded. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Hale leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Jared Lawson's not just some corrupt politician, Carter. His eyes were sharp. He's been in bed with the mob for decades. David clenched his fists. So what now? Hale let out a slow breath. We've got two problems. One, you. David blinked. Me. Hale nodded. Jared's already turned the public against you. If we don't fight back fast, he'll bury you in a fake criminal record, and no one will listen to a damn word you say. David gritted his teeth. He had fought battles overseas, but this? This was a war being fought in the shadows. And problem number two, he asked. Hale pushed the file toward him. The people Jared works for. David swallowed hard. The mob. Jared had been laundering money for them for years, making dirty business look clean. Melissa had gotten too close to the truth, and she had paid for it with her life. Now, David was digging too deep. And if Jared couldn't shut him up in court, the mob would do it another way. Meanwhile, in Jared Lawson's office, Jared stood at the window, staring at the city below. His hands were clenched into fists. He had spent his entire career building this life. The money, the power, the connections. Now, because of one washed-up veteran, it was all falling apart. The door opened behind him. His fixer, Darren Cole, stepped in. A former FBI informant turned political strategist. Jared turned. Tell me you have something. Cole nodded. I do. He tossed a manila folder onto the desk. We found something on Carter. Jared snatched it up, opened it, and then, for the first time in days, he smiled. This, he muttered, flipping through the pages. This is what I needed. Cole smirked. Thought you'd like it. Jared exhaled, relief flooding through him. Because David Carter had just made a mistake. And Jared? He was about to use it against him. Hours later, in Motel's safe house, David sat on the edge of the motel bed, hands gripping his knees. He had been hunted before, but this time was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about justice. A knock on the door made him jump to his feet. His instincts screamed danger, but then, it's Hale. David exhaled, unlocked the door. Detective Hale stepped inside, his face unreadable. David frowned. What's wrong? Hale shut the door behind him. We've got a problem. David stiffened. Bigger than the mob trying to kill me? Hale sighed. Yeah. He pulled out his phone, opened a video, and held it up. David felt his blood run cold. On the screen was security footage from a convenience store. The timestamp? 3 days ago. David was in the frame. And worse, so was a dead man lying at his feet. David's stomach twisted. What is this? Hale lowered the phone. According to the media, it's you killing a man in cold blood. David took a step back. No, he said quickly. That's not what happened. Hale's expression didn't change. Then what did? David's mind raced back to that night. The alley. The fight. The guy who had tried to mug him. The knife. David had been defending himself. But the way the footage was cut, it didn't look like self-defense. It looked like murder. This is *T, David muttered. Someone edited this. Hale nodded. I know. But that doesn't matter, Carter. Right now, the public sees this, and they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. David exhaled sharply. Jared. This was his move. Destroying David's credibility wasn't enough. Now, he was framing him for murder. And the worst part? It was working. The news cycle was already eating it up. By morning, David Carter wouldn't just be a homeless man with a wild story. He'd be a wanted criminal. Meanwhile, in Jared's estate, Jared poured himself a drink, watching the news coverage unfold. He took a slow sip of whiskey, savoring the victory. David Carter was done. Tomorrow, he'd be in cuffs. Or in the ground. Either way, Jared had won. Or so he thought. Because David Carter wasn't done fighting yet. The world had turned against him. David Carter sat in the dim motel room, his fists clenched, his mind racing. The framed security footage was everywhere. Every news station. Every social media feed. Dangerous fugitive on the run. Homeless veteran wanted for murder. Is this the man lying about Jared Lawson? David wasn't just being discredited anymore. Jared wanted him erased. And by morning, the cops wouldn't be looking for a witness. They'd be looking for a killer. David had one shot. One move left to make. If he didn't act now, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison or end up in a body bag. Meanwhile, in Jared Lawson's estate, Jared stood by his office window, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his phone in the other. "Everything's in place?" he asked. On the other end, his fixer, Darren Cole, chuckled. "By tomorrow morning, Carter will be nothing more than a memory." Jared exhaled, savoring the moment. He had played the game perfectly. First, he buried Melissa Harper. Then, he buried the truth. And now, he was about to bury David Carter. Or so he thought. Because outside, in the darkness, a pair of eyes watched him from a distance. David was already here. And tonight, it all ended. 30 minutes later, inside Jared's estate, Jared sat at his desk, reviewing the latest poll numbers. Even after all the drama, he was still leading in the upcoming election. By next week, this would all be a bad memory. A soft creak made him pause. His brow furrowed. Had one of his guards come in? He turned and froze. David Carter stood in the shadows, eyes cold, a gun pointed straight at Jared's chest. Jared's mouth went dry. His mind raced for a way out. You just made a big mistake," Jared said slowly, lifting his hands. "Killing me. That won't fix anything." David didn't blink. "If I wanted to kill you," he said, voice low, steady, "you'd already be dead." Jared swallowed hard. "So what do you want?" David took a slow step forward. "I want the truth." Jared forced a smirk. "And what truth is that?" David pulled something from his pocket. A recording device. He clicked play, and the room filled with Jared's own voice. "By tomorrow morning, Carter will be nothing more than a memory." Jared's face went pale. He shot to his feet. "Where the hell did you get that?" David smirked. "Let's just say," he said, "your fixer isn't as loyal as you think." Jared felt the blood drain from his face. Darren Cole. That traitorous son of a... He lunged for the phone on his desk. But David was faster. Bang! A shot rang out. Not at Jared. At the phone, blasting it into pieces. Jared staggered back, shaking. "You think that recording will save you," he spat. "You have no proof I killed Melissa Harper." David reached into his pocket again and tossed something onto Jared's desk. Jared's heart stopped. Because there, staring back at him, was Melissa Harper's blood-stained necklace. David's eyes burned into him. "You remember this, don't you?" Jared backed up. "No. This isn't possible." David took another step forward. "You spent years covering your tracks," he said. "Making sure no one ever found her. Making sure no one ever found the evidence." David's grip tightened on his gun. "But you missed something." Jared shook his head violently. No. This is a setup. You have nothing." David smirked. "Then why are you sweating?" Jared staggered, his mind spinning. If David had the recording and the necklace, then it was over. This was checkmate. And then, the front doors burst open. "Police! Hands up!" Detective Hale stormed in, gun raised, officers flooding the room behind him. Jared barely had time to process before he was tackled to the ground. His face smashed against his own office floor. "Jared Lawson," Hale said, voice laced with satisfaction, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact." Jared thrashed, but it was useless. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. David took one last satisfied breath. For 20 years, He had carried the weight of this secret. For 20 years, he had been haunted by the truth no one believed. And now, the world finally knew. 3 weeks later, in the courtroom, Jared Lawson sat in orange prison fatigues, his lawyer desperately arguing for bail. The judge's expression was stone cold. Bail denied. David sat in the back, arms crossed, watching as Jared was dragged away in chains. For the first time in his life, David Carter wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just a homeless man no one cared about. He was a survivor. And he had won. 6 months later, the city was different now. Jared Lawson's trial had rocked the nation. His entire corrupt empire collapsed. And David Carter, he had finally gotten his honor back. Standing outside a small but cozy apartment, he looked at the keys in his hand. For the first time in years, he had a home. A place to rest. A place to start again. As he stepped inside, a faint smile touched his lips. Justice had finally been served. And David Carter was no longer a forgotten man. The end. What a ride. Before you go, let's hear from you. What did you think of the ending? Did Jared get what he deserved? Would you have done what David did? Or would you have let the past stay buried? And if you loved this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales like this one. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.